And I'm going to turn us over to Dr. Fawcett. All yours.
Thank you, Scott. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. We talk about topics related to addiction. I usually talk about a topic for about 10 minutes or so. And there's a topic that certainly is a major component to addiction I've been wanting to speak about, but it is one that really affects everybody right now. And I think it's sort of an epidemic going on. And that's something that relates, I think it's been on our minds, and that's really loneliness and isolation. And it's been really making headlines. In fact, the New York Times had an article just a couple of weeks ago how it is really epidemic among everyone today. But I think when we talk about people impacted by addiction, whether it's partners, whether it's the addict themselves, whether it's families, there's just an increasingly amount of, there's an extra layer, I guess, of isolation and loneliness that goes with the addictive process. And I think it just makes it that much more painful. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what that subjective experience feels like and what that means in terms of some of our inner thought processes that go with that sometimes, because I think that can be a little more subtle than you might think in terms of some of the core beliefs that we have about ourselves. And then I'd like to go to some more specific techniques that we might be able to use to kind of counterbalance some of those maybe true, or rather core beliefs that aren't so true about ourselves, or things that maybe some techniques that we can use. But first of all, how loneliness feels, right? What does it feel like? And it's really this series of beliefs that really start to undermine our sense of importance, our sense of relevance to anyone in the world. And so a lot of these I statements that I'm going to read really become emblematic, I think, of people that are experiencing loneliness, experiencing isolation. So the one that I think really stands out to a lot of people would be, I feel like I'm not important to anyone. So that feeling of just like not being of significance, not mattering whether you show up or not believing that it matters whether you live or die in the most dramatic of cases. I feel like nobody needs me. Feeling like a third wheel, feeling like you're not important to anyone, feeling like that doesn't really matter if you show up or not, that you're not significant, that you're not important at all. I feel like I don't really exist. This, I think, also can be quite profound for addicts and even partners whose sense of reality can get quite distorted sometimes. And for addicts who can live off in kind of a fantasy world and get caught between reality and consequences and the emotional pain and the numbness of the fantasy life, or the partners who are caught also between similar ups and downs of painful reality and disconnect and kind of withdrawal and numbing, that sense of, that can lead to the sense of what we sometimes call derealization, where we just kind of disconnect from the sense of like, what is up, what is down, what is real, what is not. And it just, that all contributes to the sense of ungrounding and disconnect that is very important for us to sort of stay, so we know which side is up, literally, in our emotional compass. I feel alone within myself. Again, probably every week here, I talk about the importance of connection. And I think when we start to feel alone within ourselves, that is the sense of adrift, that there's like, we're unmoored in society, in our connections, and kind of adrift with ourselves. And that's just a very unsettling place to be. Yet it goes with this next one, that it feels safer to be alone. Then I can't get rejected. So we're in this incredibly painful place where it's painful to be by ourselves, but it's even more painful to be with other people where we might be rejected, we might be hurt, and so on. I feel like I don't have meaningful relationships. I don't feel like I have anyone to tell me my good news to. In other words, there's nobody to share joys with. There's certainly nobody to share the pain with. Feel alone when I'm surrounded by people. So you get a sense, right, of this disconnect, this unmoored sense, this ungrounded sense, this sense of no validation. So that subjective inner experience of loneliness is one of immense pain. And unfortunately for a lot of addicts and partners, that resonates with historic pain, with old traumas, with old wounds, with really a lifetime of experiences that can sometimes come alive, become activated with these feelings in the present day, and it'll kind of start to resonate with old pain and old wounds, and actually kind of we talk about 1 + 1 = 3, the sort of cumulative sum of those things can have a synergistic effect that can actually cause more problems than you might think. So given that, and given that this is going on, and given that we're just emerging from the pandemic, and in many parts of the country, the rates are going up again, and God forbid that we have to sort of pull back and start to shelter more in place or whatever we need to start doing. There's some things we can do. And I've tried to make a list that would go whether we can do stuff in person or we have to do stuff sort of remotely. But the first thing I think is to start a conversation or start conversations. And by that, I mean, reaching out. And during the pandemic, I was often suggesting that we make daily commitments to reach out, whether it's a text, a phone call, a gesture, to reach out and connect with people, to check on people, loved ones, friends, social acquaintances, just to keep those connections kind of active, just a little spark across our community to kind of keep those connections going, to let somebody know that we care about them, we're thinking about them, right? We may not be able to talk to them or see them or even hug them, but we know that that little conscious contact was made across time and space. I think that's really important. Now that we can somewhat do things in person, I've been having great joy in meeting people again for coffee or having people for lunch or breakfast or whatever I can find time to do. But we can meet people in person, but we can also make a phone call or we can do Zoom meetings. So I think those kind of conversations, and I think certainly if things tighten up again, we can still do video chats or we can send texts or we can do FaceTime or whatever we can do. But that contact, we cannot let that lapse. We cannot let that get weak again, because that's really incredible. And I'm talking about our entire circle, not just our loved ones. And that's, of course, that's the priority, obviously. But I'm talking about our friends, our close friends, our casual friends, our colleagues, our neighbors, our coworkers. I think this is where we really have to sort of take the effort to connect people in our lives, because sometimes if we don't do it, it doesn't happen, right? So I think that's important. The next thing I think is to really make best use of our time. We're all busy. We all have probably busier than ever before because we're juggling so much stuff, trying to play catch up. So I think really we really have to think about how to be efficient and efficient with our time and our social time. And I think I've had to really analyze, I guess, how I use my social media time. And I never was a huge amount of social media time waster, I guess. But what I've decided to do is to use social media and any time I spend on it to use it to connect for other activities. So I use social media to connect for real-time activities, or I'll use social media to find somebody I haven't talked to in a while. I'll use social media to arrange a coffee date with somebody, or to go to an AA meeting I haven't gone to in a while, or figure out what the time is, or what the Zoom link is, or I use it as a means to creating real world connection. And I think if we can all do that, it sort of makes for a richer experience, as opposed to using social media just as an ends into itself, right? As a means to itself, where you just kind of are on there seeing who's doing what, and just kind of a time wasting kind of thing. In that regard, in real time stuff, I think, and this is, boy, if the more we can do it, was ever a good time to do it, the more I think we can get out there and start to do service work in our communities, the better. There is so much need. And I just can speak as a therapist, both trying to place clients who are looking for therapists, and the number of calls I get from my office, there are so many people seeking mental health services, and there is such a strain on the service. There is just not enough providers to be able to meet the need. And that goes far beyond just professional therapists down to community services, soup kitchens, volunteer agents, every kind of social service agency is strained. And so I think if you have a service, if you have a skill, if you have time, if you have an hour a week, just please get out and see what you can do to help out, because I think that is also an incredible way to combat your own sense of isolation and loneliness. I think what I learned early on in my own recovery, one of the great ways to get out of my own sense of victimhood and misery and self-absorption was to go out and work with other people and just kind of forget my own stuff for a while. And it really is an amazing technique. So any kind of volunteering, service work like that you can do. And then the final thing, well, two final things. One, to be gentle with ourselves. I think we are our own worst enemy. I've done webinars on this session about kind of that critical voice that we all have, that self-talk that is kind of hardwired into our brains sometimes, where it just won't shut up. The kind of undermining stuff that we have to really work very hard to kind of turn down or hopefully diffuse and unplug or turn off totally. But during these times when we're stressful, when we don't have our adequate support, when we don't have, so sometimes the people that are our best cheerleaders around us with regularity, we need to be able to be gentle with ourselves. And then the final tip I have, to really have compassion for ourselves. And I think we sometimes are our own worst enemy. And I think if we can sort of build compassion, so often I hear that, one of the big, really one of the big casualties of addiction, and certainly sex addiction, is empathy and compassion. And that's certainly true. And it certainly goes for the partners and for the families, but it also goes for the addict. And I think one of the essential recovery steps, and actually it's the essential step for the addict to build compassion and empathy for their partners. I think they can't feel it for somebody else unless they start to feel it for themselves. And I don't mean that in kind of a selfish, self-indulgent way. I think unless we feel some compassion for at least the wounded part of ourselves, maybe it's that wounded child within each of us, to have that some compassion and empathy for that wounded part of ourselves, that at least gives us access to our heart. And our heart gives us access to compassion and empathy for other people. So I think just that kind of kindness in spirit and attitude goes a long way in this. And I think I'll close with this. I think just in this time when we're all experiencing such loneliness and isolation, just to go around with that understanding that everybody's in the same boat, right? And to just go to practice kindness toward everybody, remembering that they are probably having just as much of a stressful day as you are. And so to just have a little compassion. And I think I'll close with that. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, David. David texted me a little while ago, earlier this afternoon, and said he was thinking about talking about loneliness. I was like, that's a great topic. It's been coming up a lot lately. And as he started talking, I realized I ran a discussion group on Tuesday that I run every week, and I filled in a group on Sunday and a group today. And all three of the groups, in one way or another, we were talking about variations on this theme. Wow. And it's just, apparently this is the week for us to deal with this. Wow. And I do have some things I want to either bring up or ask you here. One of them, Dr. Rob often says, addiction is an intimacy disorder. And, most of us have seen the Johann Hari TED Talk, where he talks about addiction is an intimacy disorder. And, he says the cure for addiction is not sobriety, it's connection. And it's kind of what we don't do in our addiction. And we don't do it because it's scary. One of your statements was it's safer to be alone. It's painful to be alone, but it's safer to be alone. So it's safer to be alone. We like safety, but it's painful. So we turn to an addictive substance or behavior. That's what addiction is all about. It's not about pleasure. Sex addiction is not about sex. It's about escaping the pain of not feeling connected, basically, not feeling safe with other people. So my first question is, when we really don't feel safe with other people, we have childhood trauma, we have childhood wounds, we have learned that, our loved ones, usually our parents, will not be there for us, or will be there in unhealthy ways, or will be there inconsistently, or we've learned not to trust that other people will meet our needs. How do we overcome this fear of basically rejection in one form or another?
I think it's a real trap, because the belief when we're caught in that is that if I move outside of myself, it's just danger. And so what's missing there is that we don't see the resources that we may have within ourselves. And I think that's the thing I think that I would encourage people to do, is that to find the resources within themselves. I think sometimes, usually if I'm working with a client on an issue like this, we can dig around and find somebody, and it might be like a grandmother or a grandfather or some kind person in that person's life, even if they had a pretty awful childhood, right? There's usually somebody that represented some kind of kindness or strength that that person can kind of think about as almost like a role model, and kind of embody that person's voice, and like, hey, what would they do? What would they say? And kind of use that person as a model to kind of become a model for themselves, to kind of talk themselves out of that and really not get caught in the loneliness, but find the courage within themselves to make a move and move out of it. And I think very quickly, almost kind of, this is a bad analogy, but kind of when you hit back at a bully, they kind of fizzle, right? I think if we can find the courage to break through some of the loneliness and isolation, it kind of, some of the illusion of it fades a little bit, the power of it, because that we can see that we actually do have some agency over how we feel and how we control our feelings and how we can connect with other people. The illusion gets shattered a little bit, but I think we have to be able to dig around within ourselves and find some kind of resource. And some people turn to spirituality, some people turn to some image of themselves, and some people have to look outside themselves. But usually we can import some kind of strength that helps us move out of it and stand up on our own.
Early in recovery, I was still pretty disconnected, and somebody told me, if you want to have friends, you need to be a friend. Yeah. And you start by reaching out to other people and just asking how they're doing, just not about me at all. I just really enjoyed your share at the meeting, would love to have coffee, discuss it some more, or can I call you to ask you about this, or, to show interest in other people. And even that was hard, but it was a lot easier to do that than say, hey, let's hang out and be buddies. It's just like, I thought nobody wanted to be my buddy, but they might want to, talk about something they did that I think is great. And it just show interest a couple times and people will reciprocate usually, So one other question I want to ask you, solitude versus loneliness. What's the difference? Is one healthy? Is neither healthy? What are we shooting for here?
Yeah, it's a great observation, a great question. So I think, let me start by saying a lot of people have observed that you can be lonely in the middle of Times Square, right? So loneliness is not a factor of being surrounded by people or not. Loneliness is kind of more of a head space and emotional space. And loneliness is not a great emotional space to be in. Solitude, on the other hand, I think is something that is a relatively positive thing. And I would go as far as to say a necessary thing. I think human beings are kind of wired to need time by ourselves in solitude. And that doesn't mean disconnected, but it means with ourselves, with our thoughts, with our feelings, reflecting, being reflective, meditating. And I think our brains are kind of designed to need that. And I think building that into our lives, even our days, can be really useful. So I think, so I guess maybe I would say alone time as opposed to loneliness, if I'm going to substitute alone for solitude, would be a good thing. And I think, and again, it's about the attention. I want to take this time to reflect and maybe meditate and be mindful, as opposed to isolating and because I'm feeling bad about myself. So there's a difference there between what I'm doing and how I'm thinking about it and how I'm approaching it. So I think it's about the intention of it. But certainly I think this is not about being with people 24/7. This is about finding balance between healthy connections with people and also healthy connection with myself, and being able to spend time with myself in a healthy way.
Thank you. We have questions. We've got a couple left over from last week, and we've got some in the Q&A feature here. The first question left over from last week, and they're the first question from this week. I'm going to ask them together because they're both about SSRIs, which are selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are basically a form of antidepressants. So the question from last week is, are there SSRIs for mild depression which do not have sexual side effects? So there's really two there. What are the sexual side effects that we see with some? And are there some that don't have sexual side effects? And then the question that popped in today about SSRIs is, there it is, come back. I've recently gone on an SSRI med for anxiety. I found it has made a huge difference in my impulse control and how I react to situations. I'm far less chaotic and I am far more present to my wife. Is this common? Is it only transient? Will it go away if I stop taking tablets? So several SSRI questions there.
Okay, so yeah, SSRIs are a class of antidepressant drugs that have been around a long time. They're considered really stable, really safe, very few dangerous side effects. And for that reason, a lot of general physicians, internists will prescribe them as opposed to going to a psychiatrist. Although if you're a complex kind of client, I'd still suggest springing for a psychiatrist. But however, to answer these questions, SSRIs are used for several different things. Notably, they're very effective antidepressants. However, they're also used sometimes for obsessive compulsive disorder, for example. In some cases for different kinds of anxiety. OCD, obsessive compulsive, is an anxiety disorder. And so they have, and they're very effective, as this person just wrote, in terms of some of those behavioral disorders, in terms of reducing compulsions and so on. So in that regard, they're a really good fit for some people. Now, to a greater or lesser extent, and there's many different SSRIs, most of them have, to a greater or lesser extent, some kind of sexual side effects, meaning that they reduce sexual desire, they delay orgasm, they impair erectile, they cause erectile dysfunction to some extent, not always. So there are some issues, right? Now, I've had guys in recovery from sex addiction who actually kind of didn't find that to be a problem initially, because it kind of took some of the sexual intensity off the table a little bit. It reduced it, which actually helped them in their early recovery. But it's something to be aware of. Now, there are antidepressants that are not SSRIs that are also very effective that do not have those side effects. And as I say, some of the SSRIs have fewer than others. But in general, the SSRIs are a really great class of medications. And I'd certainly talk with your doctor about it. It's one of those, well, like any medication, right? No medication is totally benign. So it's a risk-benefit thing. Depending on what you might be interested in taking it for, it's really worth having a talk with your doctor about the potential benefits versus the potential downside, and make that decision for yourself and see what the options are. The other thing, by the way, to be said just about antidepressants in general and SSRIs specifically, they're all approved for, and the best results in all the literature over years has shown that the best results come from a combination of taking the medication and going to therapy, as opposed to just taking the meds or just going to therapy. If you do both, you'll have far better outcome.
If you're in recovery from addiction, if you do recovery work and therapy and the meds, even better. You know, the more you do, the more you got. So, and there are doctors out there, because of the sexual side effects from SSRIs, for sex addicts in early recovery and porn addicts in early recovery, doctors will choose an SSRI over one of the other meds to get the extra benefit, which the person who asked this question obviously not looking at as a benefit, but the benefit of having some sexual side effects, which kind of reduce desire and functionality. And in early recovery, I'll tell you, I was on an SSRI in early recovery, and I was grateful for that side effect.
A lot of guys with methamphetamine with very similar issues do the same thing.
Yeah. So the other question here, this person is having great benefit, far less chaotic, able to be more present in his relationship. Is this common? Is it only transient? Does it go away if you stop taking the meds?
So in my experience, the benefit, once you have a benefit from a drug like this, it tends to be pretty persistent for a while. Now, the thing with SSRIs and really with any medication, you can have this benefit for a year, 2 years, 3 years, and it can go away quite unpredictably. And this is true of a lot of antidepressant drugs. They can go on for a while and then for kind of no apparent reason just not work as well. And you may have to switch down the road. But I would say, and by the way, a lot of people go through a lot of trial and error before they find one that works as well as you found one like you have. So that goes in your gratitude list. And I would say just be grateful for it and enjoy it. And if it's working well, and it sounds like it's really doing its job for you in a very great way, just monitor it and go with it. Sometimes people need to increase their dose after a while, but usually there's only 2 levels of dosage on these anyway. So, but I would just stay in close touch with your doctor. And by the way, I want to say I'm not a physician. I've been around these things a long time, but I'm not a physician. So let me just say that. But it sounds like you're in good hands here, and I think it's working well. And I don't think I'd change it.
Dr. Fawcett is a doctor. He's just not a medical doctor, but he knows a lot about this stuff.
As a friend of mine says, not a real doctor. Okay.
You're a real doctor. I'm not going to let you do that. This is a question from last week too. As an addict, I have a really poor sense of my partner's emotions. How can I be better at this? So you mentioned empathy earlier. Empathy question.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a classic, right? We know that intensity addictions like sex and porn notoriously, along with amphetamines, by the way, all of which, and this is not just the addict being a bad person. There's a neurochemical basis for some of these changes where the person's ability to have compassion and empathy kind of gets disconnected. And the good news is that it comes back with recovery and with some good work at it, but there's some skills involved. And it's not just a matter of disconnecting the empathy and compassion. What we have found, there's a part B to that, and that is that many addicts, if not all, we mentioned earlier that so many addicts have intimacy disorders, and there's I would say every addict does, and every addict comes in with a lot of mistaken beliefs about vulnerability and trust and communication. And I would say most addicts don't know how to do relationships very well and intimacy. And so it's not just a matter of learning or relearning how to do compassion and empathy. It's learning almost the whole set of relationship skills again, right? And so we're talking skills, and a lot of these skills start, as I mentioned earlier, with the person themselves. And you can't have a relationship with someone else until you start to have a relationship with yourself. And that's not just kind of psychological double speak. It really is kind of connecting with yourself, your inner child, the wounds you have, having compassion for yourself, as I mentioned, all that kind of finding out kind of who am I and how did I end up in this place and what do I need to heal, and kind of understanding yourself a little bit more. Once that starts to take form, then you're able to start to understand other people as well. And once you start to have feelings yourself, I mean, but the very definition of empathy is feeling what someone else is feeling. If you don't have feelings yourself, how in the world can you have a sense of what somebody else is feeling, right? So all this is a process. But what I'm saying here is these are skills, and they're skills that can be learned. They're skills that need to be learned in therapy, but these skills for empathy and compassion are classic. And they're skills that are learned in the process of going to recovery groups, in going to therapy, and doing things like disclosures and step work and inventories, and all the stuff that we do as recovery activities are all practice toward building that. And in addition, in therapy, I like to do stuff from DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, we've talked about before, which really looks at some almost kind of practical skills of empathy and down to the base, like, okay, I need, you need, okay, how do we balance that out, and kind of that kind of list making and inventories, and it sounds almost too basic, but that's where we need to go sometimes. And so these are skills, and I guess what I would encourage you to do is be curious about you, be curious about your partner, practice, and communicate. And that's why I always recommend really daily, if not several times a day, check-ins where you can talk and be open and be vulnerable and just practice. And it's going to take practice, but I think just practice goodwill on both of your parts, because you're going to make mistakes. It's going when we start trying to practice empathy and compassion, it's awkward. It lands flat. Sometimes it doesn't come out right the way we mean it. I mean, we have to kind of roll past all that, right? And if it's coming from the heart, hopefully we can roll past all that and keep going. And I think that's what we have to do. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. This next question is a kind of a long one, but I'm going to read the whole thing rather than summarize, and you'll know why when I read it. So this is from a betrayed partner of a porn addict. Recently, I had this realization that at the beginning of my marriage, I experienced sexual abuse from my porn addict. I didn't know that he was an addict, and he pressured me a lot to have sex when I didn't want to. He pressured me so much that one particular time I felt raped by him. This was such a traumatic and horrifying experience. I've never talked about it with anyone. I can't even say it out loud with words. I carry so much pain from that experience. I don't know what to do. I can't even talk about it in groups because it is so painful. I've talked with my porn addict about it, but I feel he doesn't understand how traumatic this has been for me. I feel like he used me to act out, or like an object to soothe himself, but he doesn't accept that. What do I do to heal from this, on top of the betrayal and all the lying?
Wow, I'm so sorry that happened to you. It just makes me very sad to hear that. And I guess the only thing I can encourage you to do, I hope you have support. I hope you have a therapist. That is rape. Marital rape is a thing, and it happens, and that was non-consensual, and all the emotional affliction that goes with that has occurred. And I think all the repair that needs to be done, the healing that you need would be the same. And so that's the reason I ask. I hope you have support, because I think you need the kind of therapy and trauma therapy and support that that is probably the only way that's going to provide that healing for you. Now, that said, I think working with an individual therapist and a trauma therapist is going to be incredibly, well, it's going to be essential for you. And I'm going to add one other thing, and I really encourage you to do this. I'm going to ask you to find a group of other survivors where you can go and say that out loud in a group, because you need to say that out loud to a group of people that can hear you and see you and understand you. And that is going to be an essential healing piece for you too. So they are out there, believe me, and they're waiting for you, and they've been there, and you're not alone in this. We talked tonight, we opened up about being alone in our thoughts and feelings. You are not alone in this. I know how it feels, but please get connected with a therapist, get connected with a group where you feel safe, where you can talk about your experience. You are by no means unique and alone. People, this has happened before, but your journey is yours, obviously. But there's a lot of people to help walk alongside you on that journey. Okay, but get the help out there. It's there.
Yeah, and thank you for rustling up the courage to, type this question.
Yeah.
It's not easy when we start talking about deep trauma. But, just to build on what David said, trauma and shame, this is adapting from Brene Brown here, trauma and shame, which are very intertwined, They love dark, wet places. They love those corners in the back of our mind. They're like mushrooms, and they just grow like crazy in the darkness. When we bring that stuff out in the light, it loses power. It withers. You know, uh, mushrooms don't do well on a bright, sunny day. Trauma and shame don't do well when we get them out of our mouth. We got it out of our head, through our mouth, and receive some empathy from people who truly get what we're feeling. And David mentioned, marital rape is a real thing. And you also wrote in here, I feel like he used me to act out. He objectified me as a way to self-soothe himself. I want to validate that happens. I teach a lot of our work groups, and David, of course, does a lot of work at our treatment center. I think we've both heard guys say, I was cheating on my wife with my wife. And what they mean is they were using their wife as an object, the same way they were using porn or a prostitute or whatever else it was, any other kind of sex worker, or, just an object. There's no face, no personality. It didn't matter. And wives, I've filled in on some of the betrayed partner discussion groups, and I've heard so many of them say, I just feel like a receptacle. And, this is not, the difference between addictive sex, speaking from the addict perspective, and healthy sex is intimacy, it's connection. If I have intimacy with you and feel connected, I'm going to ask you for sex probably because it's a way to heighten the intimacy, but I'm not going to pressure you because I'm going to be enough in tune with you that when you say, I'm really not up for it right now, I'm going to back off, because I'm connected to you in a way that I can tell that you're sensing pain. But as David mentioned earlier, as addicts, poof, empathy gone. And we're very self-serving. It doesn't mean that we're horrible people. It means our addiction has pushed us into becoming very, very self-serving. And we do horrible things sometimes. And I'm just so sorry you have experienced this. I mean, I'm sorry. And thank you again for asking the question. Next one here. Is it possible to build psychological resilience, or are some people just born more resilient than others? David, this is right in your alley. You are the king of resilience.
I am. This is like a cue for one of my talks. Well, let me tell you, a lot of people think that resilience is just like a character trait they're born with or not. And there's been a lot of research on resilience. Resilience is a skill set. Resilience is a set of things that we can learn how to do for ourselves. So the answer is that everybody can learn to be resilient. Resilient is a set of it's 100 decisions a day that lead us at the end of the day to deciding in a way that things are more protective than they are risky. And there are ways of protecting ourselves and making decisions that benefit us down to the smallest things, right, that add up to a bigger picture by the end of the day. And so, yes, resilience includes a lot of things. And by the way, it includes some of the things we mentioned tonight, talking about loneliness and isolation, when we're thinking, we're the only ones and we're all by ourselves and no one cares, and all those kind of isolating thoughts when we get in our own heads. All those are really counteracting any kind of sense of resilience we have, because resilience is all about having a sense of agency, feeling that we have some kind of power or control, or at least taking action. We may not have a control over the result, but we can at least take action on our own behalf. We can reach out. We can have some sort of effort, at least of self-care. We can take care of ourselves. So there's certain things we can do. And I think that's staying connected. I mean, there's a lot of stuff we can do. And so I think those are all the elements of resilience that I like to think about. So don't allow yourself to get into the trap of thinking that, I'm not one of those people, because we all are if we choose to be. And so I think it's a matter of learning to believe. And sometimes, frankly, I think a lot of us were taught, or at least implied, to think that, we just didn't have it in us. There were some lessons we got early on, or messages we got early on as kids that, well, maybe we're just we don't have those kind of smarts, or maybe we're just not that kind of kid, or whatever. And I think those messages are sometimes wrong because maybe we're a lot more success prone than we might have been told we were. And so I just encourage you to challenge any beliefs you might have about yourself that you're not resilient. Really challenge where those came from and see if those are true or not. That's all. I'm curious about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Some of the negative tapes that play in our head, most of the negative tapes that play in our head were installed early in life, usually by our parents. And they're not true. You know, they're just not. You're dumb. No, I'm not dumb. You just have been telling me I was dumb. I thought I was dumb, you know, until I went back to school and aced it, and got a, you know, or whatever. But yeah, there's a concept called obstacle immunity. And there's a podcast out there called, I think it's called the Obstacle is the Way. And basically what that title means and what obstacle immunity is, you know, as addicts, you know, again, I always speak from the addict perspective. I am the addict, but you know, we see an obstacle and we just stop and just make a nest, like, you know, rather than overcoming the obstacle, you know, because it just seems too hard. But, you know, as part of recovery, you know, people, we say, okay, well, why don't you go to the dentist? You haven't been in 10 years. You know, why don't you get a medical checkup? You haven't been to the doctor in 12 years. You know, how long has your engine light been on it in the car? Maybe you should take it in and get it looked at. You know, your low tire pressure light is on. Why don't we put some air in there? You know, because, you know, this stuff just drags on for months and months and months. I had one guy who was brand new to recovery, and I had given him my phone number, and he was at the grocery store. And he said, should I buy, he was recently divorced. So this is the first time he'd been to the grocery store in a long time. He said, should I buy ketchup or catsup? And I was like, which one is cheaper? Catsup. Okay, get that. You know, but he couldn't even decide, you know, on the spelling of ketchup, you know, because, you know, he hadn't faced any obstacles in 30 years because he'd just been an addict for that long. But obstacle immunity is, once we start overcoming, you know, the little obstacles, we start then realizing we can overcome the medium, and then we overcome the big ones, and then we start looking for them because we get a sense of accomplishment when we take care of our problems. And this is a part of psychological resilience, I think, is just having some, looking at an obstacle and saying, I can handle that.
Which is the opposite of what an addict does, right? Which is avoid.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Avoid all that. So yeah.
Yeah, we'll curl up in a pile of doo-doo and make a nest there, you know, and just, we stay there long enough that we go nose blind, and, you know, it's warm and soft, and, you know, and it's easier than dealing with something. You know, terrible metaphor, sorry. So
You're very graphic tonight, Scott. I'm getting a lot of images.
I'd like to unsay that one, but not happening, apparently. Hello, Dr. Fawcett. Do you have any advice for a porn addict whose sexual life suffers because of addiction, especially for an addict who has no prior experience of what healthy sex life looks like, which is very common with porn addicts, by the way. So thoughts on that, David?
You know, I'm just thinking, there's so many ways that it can suffer. I'm just trying to figure out how to frame the response. Yeah, I think, well, you know, the idea of prior healthy sex, I think that's a really important notion, because I think so often we think about reclaiming healthy sex and intimacy, or recapturing the way it used to be, or sort of, and it took me a while, even as a professional, to realize, every addict, myself included, I didn't have any intimacy skills. There was no reclaiming anything. I think I used drugs and alcohol to disinhibit me enough to move through, you know, this huge array of inhibitions that I had. And my addictions helped me kind of fight through those to function at some weird level, but not in a healthy way. And so, you know, without those addictions, I had to really learn how to face all the awkwardness and vulnerability and, of facing somebody in an intimate situation without all my armor. And so that's a really amazing and very scary prospect. And so I think, to go maybe back to one of the themes tonight, is to really be gentle with yourself, first of all, because this is scary stuff. And I think to start really at the beginning, because addiction, especially sex and porn addiction, is all wrapped up with this intimacy disorder stuff, where we don't really know how to connect with people in healthy ways. And so a lot of this is going to be, as I've talked about tonight, really starting to create a relationship with yourself. And it's not sexual per se, but it's all about relationships and intimacy and emotions that really create a healthy sex life down the road. I think just we're going to be rolling out later this year at Seeking Integrity, a 6-week work group on both healthy sexuality and one on intimacy. And those are inspired really because so many clients we've encountered have no idea what healthy sex is or what intimacy looks like. And so I think it's a way of kind of providing at least a pathway towards some of that for people. But there's some really great books out there. There's some great workbooks out there. But I would really start, especially if you're in early recovery, to really start, just work on yourself, work on the steps, follow, kind of keep your nose to the grindstone in terms of just your own recovery. And remember, the sort of order of the steps, it's not about engaging in sexual activity and intimacy right off the bat, right? It's about getting your recovery in shape and knowing that, and not without, I don't want to scare you, but I think this is a big deal. You're really you're changing how you look at sex and intimacy in a very profound way, moving from a whole addictive kind of model, which clearly doesn't work or is not working for people by the time they come to a room like this, into a whole other way. And that's going to take time and patience. And there's lots of guides, there's lots of ways to do it in practice out there, but it's going to take time and patience and probably a lot of therapy too, and groups, and it's going to take work and commitment. So just Scott, do you have anything to talk about the process? I think I'm kind of butchering this answer, but
yeah. This is one of the really good workbooks that's out there, that David mentioned. And we actually, this accompanies our online work groups for porn addiction, which I strongly suggest if you're a porn addict, you sign up, because there are some very specific issues that we see with porn addicts. One of them is even the guys who are married, who've been married for 30, 40 years, don't know what healthy sex looks like because they've been living in a sexual fantasy, usually since they were teenagers. And the younger guys, a lot of the younger guys come to the groups, they've never had in-person sex. It's their entire sex life. They discovered porn at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old. And that's all they know about sex. It's their sex education. And what happens is they get compulsive with it pretty early. And then they don't learn all of the real world lessons that non-porn addicted kids are learning, like how to go on a date and how to have an awkward conversation while you're on a date, and how to approach somebody about the first kiss, or how to that there's give and take, that that physical bodies don't always feel like we think they will. And it can be a little surprising, and it's like, oh, I wasn't expecting that, or and you have to get sober from the addiction first. Then we have to do all the work on underlying issues, usually trauma and shame and all of that stuff that underlies any kind of addiction, not just porn addiction. And then we start thinking about learning all the skills that we haven't learned because we started using porn compulsively when we were 10. It's a process, but it can be done. And sex addicts are the same as porn addicts with this, that sex addicts have no clue what healthy sex is either. their version of healthy sex is more is better. And that's not usually the case. That's why they end up seeing us. Porn addicts, this goes back to what we talked about earlier. Yeah, I want to be connected, but it doesn't feel safe. And what requires more vulnerability than trying to connect romantically and sexually with another human being? It's a lot safer. Porn never says no. Porn does not reject anyone ever. Porn has never said the word no. It's always there. We always know what we're going to get from it. And it's really tough for porn addicts to move forward into the kind of relationship they would like to have, because they got to learn the skills. Even the ones who really didn't start using porn heavily, until, their 30s or 40s or whatever, they still pretty much didn't learn the skills previously. So yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say one other thing about the porn business, and that's how just it revs up the escalation and the tolerance, so that sex addiction does the same thing, where it drives up the baseline level of dopamine to such an extent where the minimum required to get any kind of arousal at all is so high that it's only achievable with artificial means, right? With pornography or some kind of stimulation achievable through the addiction. So normal sexual encounters just don't come close to matching the level of arousal needed to feel satisfying or even arousing. So people, that's what Scott was mentioning earlier, where a lot of these younger men who have been introduced to porn online, they have no trouble getting an erection when they're looking at porn on their computer, but when they're with their girlfriends, who obviously act very different than pornographic scenes changing 1 second after the other, they can't get an erection with their girlfriends. And the same thing happens because there's not enough stimulation, and the same thing happens with any porn addict with their human partner. And so those kind of things, and those take time. In recovery, that ability for your brain to kind of start to find arousal in normal kinds of things again, it will happen, but it's going to take some time. So things like that, to be used to your adjustment in recovery, is going to have some patience there. I think is going to be important.
Yeah. So I have one more question. That's my question. I was talking to someone the other day, and he's a sex addict in recovery, mostly a porn user. And he often hears me says, the antidote to addiction is connection. And he says, well, I'm having all this intimacy. I'm going to all kinds of meetings. I'm sharing my stuff, and other people are listening, and they're sharing their stuff, and I'm listening, but I'm not getting sober. And, I'm having all this intimacy and I'm not getting sober. And I asked him what his definition of intimacy was. He said, well, I'm sharing all my info, and they're sharing all of their info. They know my stuff. I know their stuff. And I was like, okay, so you're vomiting on each other and you're wondering why you don't feel connected. Because to me, intimacy is more about feeling connected and feeling safely connected, which is, as an addict, I can say when I started to feel safely connected with other people, that's when I didn't need to act out with my addiction anymore. Not that I'm never triggered, but I mean, it's that safe connection. And just knowing your crap and you knowing my crap is not enough. What else is needed for the kind of intimacy that will keep us sober?
I think it goes to the nature of what it is that we're sharing.
Well, yeah.
Because I think there has to be an element of vulnerability in our sharing it. And so I can get up in front of a room and, depending on what it is, even at this point, share my story, my recovery story. That doesn't feel vulnerable to me at all anymore. I've shared it 1,000 times, right? So that doesn't feel necessarily connective to a group. But if I get it in front of a group and share some, issue, the personal issue regarding a death in the family, or something much more personal that is perhaps maybe more emotionally risky for me to share. That those are the kind of issues I think that usually are more, there's more reward if I can share them because I feel like I've really been heard. Or if there's something I feel shame about, where I can really get it off my chest and share it and release it. Those are the kinds of things that are the things that are scarier for me to share are probably the ones I need to. The things that I have no worry. It's like I can share at a business meeting, right? That's not necessarily intimate because it's like facts and figures, and kind of like sharing a meeting is kind of that way in a certain sense. Not I'm being a little facetious, but I think to me the nature of what we're sharing is the key. And if we're sharing something that requires some trust and vulnerability, I think that it's that quality that makes it more vulnerable and intimate.
And I also think there's a big difference between sitting quietly while someone speaks, which I call polite, and actually hearing and feeling and taking it in, and responding from that space.
And active listening in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And caring, if there's, enough to give a response or to talk to somebody afterward and ask questions. Or there's a difference between that. And I think that to me, I thank you for helping me work through this because I couldn't figure out what to say to say, I think you're not defining intimacy correctly, but I wasn't sure how to define it. Yeah. There's just a feeling of connected that I think is missing for some people. Even when we're physically present, we're not emotionally present. And that's it for me. It's one of my bottoms as an addict was a Christmas where I was physically present, but not emotionally at all. And there are pictures from that Christmas, and my eyes are just blank.
That's the scary part. I have pictures like that of my past too.
Oh yeah,
see it.
I have pictures of me on a trip in Europe that I don't remember taking. So, I was just there, but not there. So yeah, you got to be there. Okay, we're out of time, everybody. I have one more question that just came in. I'm gonna save this for next week, and we'll ask it first next week. So, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you, David, for a great topic and great talk. And thank you everybody for great questions. We'll see you next week.
Okay, thanks everyone. Take care. Good night.